So, part three of our trawl through the history of the radio in the United Kingdom. Got to the point now where Reith has moved past the BBC O, and the BBC now exists after the kind of blatant sucking up to Stanley Baldwin's government during the general strike. So how did this, what happened afterwards? Well, the BBC quickly expanded. In 1922, when it began, there were 31 staff. By 1927, there were 773 staff, rising to 5,000 just before the onset of the Second World War. So much bigger organisation, needed bigger premises, so moved to Broadcasting House in 1932. And a very intense bureaucratic culture starts to develop in the BBC, all, of course, controlled by Reith and in his very sort of patriarchal and paternalistic style of doing things. Reith was accountable to a board of governors, but he actually sat on the board of governors as well. So, there was, the control, if you like, that Reith had was pretty extensive and virtually total, and those that he answered to, he was also part of as well. What did the BBC start to do once they become the BBC? Well, there were national and regional programmes. In 1932, they added the Empire Service to go across the colonial empire. In 1939, that became the Overseas Service. It's now known as the World Service, but it had been around since 1932, the World Service, in different guises. Committed to mixed programming as part of public service broadcasting, including the following: news. Finally, the BBC gets its hands on news. So in 1927, the Charter, which brought the BBC into existence, gave the BBC the right to broadcast their own news and become a trusted authority, albeit the news, they didn't have their own news collection service until 1934, but that would come in time. But they became an important voice in national life because of this. Tried to develop its own news gathering system, and that was fully finished by 1934. But until 1939, it still couldn't broadcast news before 6 p.m. due to some of the pressures that newspapers put on government to control how the BBC operated. And I'll come to 20th century newspapers next week, I think, or maybe the week after. I have to check the ordering. News was still very, very sensitive at this point, and the BBC still had a very close relationship with government in terms of what news it broadcast and a fear of government disapproval. So it's very much dependent on agency copy and news wires, which is something I mentioned in the Telegraph lecture. It was very anxious not to offend. Many sensitive topics such as royalty, religion, communist ideas. No, don't touch those. We don't go anywhere near them. Live radio was basically being policed. So in an example of what this meant, on April the 18th, 1930, the BBC announced that there was no news. And so they played piano music instead. They just said, nothing happened today. Carry on with your lives, Britain. Nothing occurred today of any interest to any of you. Just continue onwards. See, April the 18th, 1930 must have been quite an exciting day if the BBC weren't going to broadcast. Loads of seditious stuff going on. BBC was like, nah, didn't happen. BBC also broadcast music. Classical music was seen as best. And this was a preserve of the music department of the BBC to choose what went on. So popular music of the time, largely jazz music at that point, was seen as secondary, part of light entertainment and dealt with by the variety department, but had less stature and less play on the BBC. It's a very elitist view of what music is and what the masses should have, reflecting class biases in the structure of the BBC and the hierarchies and who worked for it. I mean, you could argue that this is, democratic. No reason why every class shouldn't have experience at a time of limited access of classical music. But to be fair, the BBC did not reflect the tastes of popular culture at the time that it was broadcasting. I think that's a fair comment to make. Something that the BBC would go to pains to be doing from the 1960s onwards, as it got challenged by ITV and when it became a television network. But in the early days of the BBC, it saw no need to do this. Now, there is a counter-argument you can make, what's wrong with classical music? People should be exposed to classical music, and I appreciate that argument. But it is also appreciated to note that the popular tastes of music at the time were not catered for on the BBC. Music was often played live, so the BBC had a symphony orchestra in 1930, and it quickly became the biggest music patron in the United Kingdom. You know, it had the biggest broadcast area, obviously, the only broadcast areas. It was a monopoly, and so very quickly the BBC established itself as a major player in the music industry. Concerts and hiring musicians, backing them up with lectures and talks about the music itself, definitely did lead to an appreciation of classical music, because it was the only game in town, effectively. There was a problem with popular music, though. In 1920s and 30s, American big band jazz music, what you call hot or sweet jazz, was becoming incredibly popular. The BBC had an extraordinarily anti-American viewpoint, viewed jazz music itself as low, vulgar, overly sexual, not something that the BBC would be broadcasting, but it did have an eye, and it was, I should say, an ear for popular taste. So what the BBC would do was instead commission and indeed create its own jazz orchestras and filter those tunes through to make it more British sounding, to take, if you like, the vulgar sexual edge off these tunes, which actually weren't that vulgar and sexual to begin with. But this is another example of the sort of paternalistic nature of the BBC and this strong ethical and moralistic set of values that the BBC implanted into its programming, which was designed to sort of not just maintain a certain moral character of the country, but really to create a particular moral character of the country also. In terms of light entertainment, you know, the BBC broadcast variety acts taken from the music halls and theatres and imitated on radio. They established variety department in 1933. This was dominated by early comedians, singers, dance bands. Now, managers and agents were first hostile, but they very quickly understood the value of national publicity. If you got on the BBC, people heard about you. It meant you got bookings all around the country. It was a goldmine to get your act onto the BBC. And therefore, managers and agents started to develop close relationships with booking agents in the BBC and the light entertainment department, forming a sort of duopoly between agents and the BBC themselves in order to promote particular acts. And some acts got absolutely huge in this time, thanks to exposure through the BBC. There was also other content being broadcast. Educational broadcasting for schools became a very early feature of the BBC. Talks department was set up in 1927 and developed further in 1932 to deliver literally lectures and talks by people, and getting very distinguished speakers like Shaw, John Maynard Keynes, for example, H.G. Wells, Chesterton. These became regular voices on the BBC. Now, you wouldn't hear like an economist of the stature of John Maynard Keynes being broadcast on the BBC, maybe on BBC Radio 4 perhaps, anymore, but these became like nationally known voices, and they're, you know, very complex and intricate theories of economics, politics, philosophy, and so on became broadcast across the network. These were often scripted to avoid offence, and some speakers and topics weren't allowed, you know, seditious left-wing politics. Oh, no, 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 we're not having any of that. Plus, there were feature programs like documentaries, and these had an important political function during the Great Depression of the 1930s, representing life across Britain, especially from the north, which had been underrepresented previously and was still underrepresented in the national newspapers. Now, as time went on, people got kind of used to the BBC very, very quickly. The BBC really ignored public taste, believing they knew best what the public needed. They opposed any kind of lazy listening, trying to encourage an active audience. Certainly didn't have a view of the radio as background noise or entertainment, which is largely how we listen to the radio in contemporary times. They wanted intelligent and discriminating listeners. Therefore, the BBC was kind of listener unfriendly in many ways. There were no continuity announcements, and it was listener unfriendly in a number of other ways too. There were no continuity announcements. There were no fixed times or lengths of programs. The schedule was absolutely all over the place. There were periods of silence put on the radio to allow reflection or for people just to turn it off. And they avoided any kind of controversial topics for fear of upsetting government. Now, whereas there was a monopoly on UK broadcasting in the BBC, that didn't mean it had a total monopoly. New sets that came out in the 1930s had a longer range of reception, and so they could pick up continental commercial stations. In Europe, radio developed in very different ways, much more along the lines of the American model, where radio license were granted to commercial industries and to commercial channels, which developed along American lines. And so very quickly in the 1930s, there suddenly appeared to be a competition for the BBC. Radio Normandy in 1931, Radio Luxembourg in 1933. These stations launched and could be picked up not just in the southeast of England, but across large parts of the country. These were stations that played more popular music and contemporary entertainment, and very quickly actually cottoned on that they had a large listenership in England, and so they started using English language programming at certain times as well to cater for their new Anglo audience. These started attracting a huge amount of listeners in the United Kingdom who got sick and tired of the paternalistic sort of talking down to that they got from the BBC all the time. This forced the BBC to respond in kind. In 1936, they carried out a listeners survey for the first time, really asking its audience, what do you want to listen to? What do you like about the BBC? What don't you like about the BBC? And in 1937, they redeveloped the variety department with a new eye to populism on the basis of this survey. So including new popular shows like In Town Tonight, Monday night at 7, Bandwagon, playing more popular music and more music in suiting with what the audience actually wanted. They increased listener participation with competitions, quiz shows, and the first ever request show on radio. Of course, television, the telephone was a feature of modern day life. You wouldn't get people going on air on the telephone. You'd have a producer who would answer calls, and then the request would be relayed in, and of course you could send letters in. You started to get actual representation of working class lives and interests in the BBC after 1937, but never working class accents. So God, no, that would just not be the done thing. People shouldn't be sounding that way. I wouldn't get on the BBC today, right? But back in that day, in those times, my accent on the BBC, I don't think so, pal. They introduced the first ever soap opera in the United Kingdom in 1938, The English Family Robinson, about middle-class suburban life. So as a piece of entertainment, you've got this radio serial, a drama that people can follow, but it is about middle-class suburban life. It's a reaffirmation of this dominant ideology in the BBC that, the dominant form of conventional living in the United Kingdom and the hegemonic form should be middle-class suburban values. This isn't a soap opera about the working classes of Liverpool or Newcastle or Manchester or Swansea. This is middle class English suburban life, and this is what we should all be aspiring to. So that strong paternal instinct in the BBC still exists, even in the changing of programming. Now, Reith's vision was a unification of all differences between people in a national identity, and BBC being the voice of a nation was a way of achieving this, promoting a sense of unity and belonging. This had huge problems, of course. Excluded all local interests and differences, kind of ignored the fact that Britain is made up of 4 different countries to begin with, and regional differences between parts of those constituent nations as well. So the national model of the BBC was actually highly nationalistic in terms of a gross sort of British nationalism and an ignorance of differences between regions and nations within the country. The bias in that model was hugely towards the southeast of England. It was a bias towards England, towards London, to the urban, to the middle classes, to the middle brow and the middle of the road. Nothing radical, nothing exciting, nothing new. And of course, to the white. Regional accents were replaced with British BBC received pronunciation. I'm not even going to try. I'm never going to sound proper, so I'm not going to try. Educated middle class home counties accents. That's what all the BBC had. So this idea of unifying the nation was actually to unify it in the vision of one particular part of the country, one particular class, and one particular set of values. And because of this, there was growing criticism of the BBC throughout the 1930s, its imposition of uniform programmes, voices, tastes, values, thoughts. This was reflected in the listeners' survey and led the BBC towards greater regional programming and input from 37. And by 38, Reith had run his time. His vision of the BBC was out of kilter with what people wanted and what people expected. And with competition, Reith's usefulness had kind of ended, albeit his impact still shapes elements of the BBC today. You know, Reith, more than any other Director General, shaped the course of the BBC even to this day, particularly in terms of politics and the idea of this imagined impartiality, where impartiality is actually status quo. So in the 30s, radio was really taking off. There were improved set designs, better reception, better sound quality, ability to pick up different stations, and the BBC reflects a lot of this as well. Radio as a medium, therefore, became an incredibly important part of the home. The falling cost of the radio brought about mass ownership for all but the poorest in British society. The arrival of the radio became a major event, and if the radio itself became kind of prototype TV. You know, you would organise your living space around the radio so everyone could listen to it. It became embraced as a domestic medium and a centerpiece of the home, gathering around the radio at night. And that kind of spatial orientation to a piece of media was a very sort of McLuhanist turn here. You know, how our bodies and how our ways of living reorganize around the media. The medium is the message. The message of the radio was of like this collective family listening, and everyone in the country copying this form of behavior, and it becomes a sort of solidifying influence on nations itself. So, preempting what I was just, what I was saying, Marshall McLuhan, in Understanding Media, he talks about radio quite clearly. There's a chapter on it. Described radio as a tribal drum, a collective medium extending consciousness of the world in a global embrace and imploding the wider world into the home with a national character to radio broadcasting, which meant it beat like a tribal drum. You know, we all beat to the same tribal drum beat. The power of radio by the 1930s has been very well acknowledged. Voices and news were brought straight to you. It was the first major domestic broadcast medium, so free information and entertainment in the home, not necessarily free in the UK because you have to pay for a license, and a collective medium bringing together the family at the same time and the nation at the same time in the same broadcast space, and therefore commanding attention and giving for the first time the possibility of broadcasting to an entire nation at once. And you start to see the popularity and the importance of world events, and the radio becomes the first medium to transmit these in real time to a huge broadcast audience. For example, the Hindenburg disaster of May the 6th, 1937, when a passenger airship exploded in New Jersey, killing 36 people. There was newsreel footage of this explosion. It's become, it's an incredibly famous newsreel footage, but the radio report by Herbert Morrison for WLS in Chicago, which was broadcast globally the next day, brought the disaster into the homes of everyone across the world. Everyone heard Morrison's very famous commentary, and I'll post a clip of Herbert Morrison's WLS broadcast up on Canvas for this, so you can check it out. But it's one of the most famous pieces of radio of all time. For example, this is, I don't know why I wanted to show you, but if you want to see a Zeppelin blow up, that's what it looks like. Aped on Led Zeppelin's first album cover. Other sort of massive collective events that occurred during the 30s, H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, created by Orson Welles on the same day as my birthday, but in a couple of years before I was born in 1938. CBC radio event presented, Wells presented the War of the Worlds as a simulated news broadcast, and people who tuned in late to this broadcast genuinely thought that aliens were invading, and they kind of panicked and rushed out onto the streets in a panic about, oh my God, the aliens are here, I just heard it on the radio. Now, this might have been over-exaggerated a little by the press that were competing with the radio at that time, but it was genuinely a huge effect of Wells' War of the Worlds. And again, I'll post War of the Worlds up on Canvas for you to listen to. But it went to show, the collective power. As everyone across America was listening to the same thing at the same time. Orson Welles' dramatization of War of the Worlds. It had a huge collective effect and became a national talking point. It became like a water cooler program before television or the water cooler really existed. It became a collective media event for people, and media events most closely associated with television, but they did exist on the radio because the radio was a broadcast medium that went to the homes of everyone, and everyone listened to the same type of thing. So real world events were being heard nightly. So the month prior to the War of the Worlds, radio had kept the American public alert to the ominous happenings throughout the world. The Munich crisis was at its height. Hitler, in his address to the annual Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg, called for the autonomy of the Sudetenland. For the first time in history, the public could tune in to their radios every night and hear, boot by boot, accusation by accusation, threat by threat, the rumblings that inevitably led to a world war. And this was, when we enter the end of the 30s, you had a public who were tuned in to international events being broadcast on the radio, and this march into the Second World War was being broadcast evening by evening. So the 1930s, obviously, a time of huge political developments, the rise of Italian, German and Japanese fascism, the rise of the Soviet Union under Stalin. All of this was brought into the homes of people across the Western world by the radio every day. It became the first domestic mass broadcast medium, and therefore is incredibly, incredibly important. And we will pick up more on this in the seminars. Thank you for listening.